How do we make sense of what it is that we're called to do with our stuff, with our money, with our possessions? What Satan is seeking to do is to subtly, slowly pull us away from the life that we are called to live over time. We're stuck trying to do the things that our society expects us to do. And somewhere along the way, kind of sprinkle a little bit of Jesus on top of it. This all stems from what you believe about God. If Satan is at work widening that gap, then our role, our job is to bridge that gap.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Purpose-Filled Money Podcast. We're your hosts, Courtney and Caleb Sams. And today we're going to be talking a lot more about budgeting. We've spent the last couple of episodes looking through Joseph's life and how we can kind of get a feel for what it means to be a good money manager. Yeah. So I thought maybe we could start by you giving us a recap of what we might have learned.
Yeah, and we'll talk through like what it is that Joseph was for. And if you think it's been a minute since you've heard our voices, we got smacked in the face by open enrollment and have just been busy. And we're still learning this podcast thing and this weekly cadence of trying to figure out our schedules and when and how we record and all that kind of stuff.
We need to learn how to better budget our time.
Yeah. Or just recognize when there's going to be times of year that it's virtually impossible to do anything with consistency. But yeah, I think as we move towards a more intentional conversation on budgeting, we spent the first few episodes of this series looking at Joseph's life and looking at the trajectory of his life, the motivation behind his actions, the lessons that he learned. And I think what we can pull from him is how does that apply to our understanding of the resources and materials and money that God has entrusted us to be stewards of. And I think one of the first things we saw with Joseph that is paramount to this conversation of getting our priorities correct is Joseph's motivation and the shift over the course of Joseph's life that was the thing that led Joseph to make the decisions that he was making, right? I mean, we see this spiral over the course of his life, and a lot of his motivation seems to be personal gain. Mm-hmm. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, from the first few kind of stories we have with Joseph, kind of encapsulated in his very first dream.
Right.
That he ultimately is going to be raised up and that his whole family is going to be bowing to him and represented by not just his family, but in the way that they're represented in, like the galaxy is gonna bow down to him.
And then you see him with Potiphar and his wife basically saying that, like, I am the most important one in this household.
Yeah.
And giving himself some sort of status and not recognizing, even though it very clearly states that God was with him, he never gives God the credit of putting him in those positions. He kind of takes that on himself and says, like, I've done all of this.
Yeah. He runs from Potiphar's wife in that temptation, which is a good value. Mm-hmm. But if you look at his list of reasons why, God's there, but he's at the bottom and at the end, it's like the last thought.
Yeah.
His first thought is, look at how far I've come. I can't risk that. I can't risk my power. I can't risk my station for you.
Yeah, and the thing wasn't even like, how can I do this sin against God? Not look at what all God has put, like God's done all of this to put me in this spot. Like, how could I do that? It was it's just in his wording, you can just see the arrogance there, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And so then you have the spiral, right? In every story of Joseph, he gets lower and lower. He goes from the heir to the house of Israel to the chief servant in Potiphar's house to the prison, and he's the leader there. Like, he keeps finding these spots where he can
his skills elevate
thrive.
Him to
And I think that kind of just is a nod to what we said at the very beginning of this conversation. And I know the story of Joseph isn't about budgeting, but Joseph's abilities and his skill set are very clear. That the problem I think we face, if you're listening to this episode, right, we've had this kind of mantra the whole time. You're probably like us. You're trying to break the cycle. You're trying to figure out how to make your life look more like the life that Scripture tells us about. You're trying to figure out, how can I become in charge of the money that God's left me so that I can be more actively involved in the kingdom and the ways that the Spirit's leading us and the Scripture's pointing us. And like Joseph, the problem isn't the ability to budget. It's clear that he has the competence to do these things. He keeps rising to the top everywhere he goes, and yet everywhere he goes is lower and lower and lower throughout the story of his life until there's a shift. And his language does start to change, that it's not me, it's God. God's not gonna, I'm not the one that does this, Pharaoh. God does this.
I hear a lot of Esther, where it's just like, I've been put into this spot for such a time as this type thing. And he has that recognition about, it's been completely by the grace of God that he's been put in situations. Yes, he has an innate skill set, but God is the one that has been using that skill set for the benefit of the kingdom.
So I think the first thing we want to pull out of Joseph's experience and try to push it into our lives is the moment where Joseph's mentality shifts, the moment where Joseph's motivation shifts from self-gain, self-preservation, self-prominence to God's work, God's plan, God's purpose. So as we move forward and look at how to budget, ways to budget, why we budget, if you're trying to answer the question of how come I have to do this every few months, how come I keep losing sight of it, how come I keep falling apart, how do I break that cycle? I think recognizing, like we've said from the very beginning of this episode, that we have an enemy that doesn't want you to do that.
Yeah.
That this is, as much as our finances and our money is a material, physical part of our lives here on earth, there are massive implications to the spiritual warfare that we're involved in if we can start to get our money right. If we can start to figure this out, it is going to make massive impact in the kingdom. It's what God's calling us to. And so Satan is actively trying to distract us, pull us apart, get us in that 1 degree off kind of path. And so the first kind of core belief, as we talked about that system in our fundamental episodes of what are some of the things we have to start to embed deep inside of us to then change our behavior, because budgeting's simply a behavior, right? So if we only start at the behavior and how do we fix it, how do we do it, what's the right way to budget, we've missed the real source starting point. And so the first thing I think we take from Joseph is, like Joseph, let's shift our focus to, it's not about self-preservation. It's not about goal-based, if we budget, we get the house. If we budget, we get the retirement. If we budget, Christmas looks good. Like, it's not goal-based, even if the goals are good. If we budget, we get to be more generous. If we budget, we get, shift it back towards molding my life as best as I can, and know that there's going to be waves and temptations and struggles throughout the course of your life that are going to have to cause you to refocus. But shifting our point from me to God, much like we see Joseph do over the course of his life.
Yeah. Yeah, I've never really thought of it that way, but no matter kind of what budget you land on, and we'll talk through this, there's different types of budgeting styles, but almost having, talking together as a family of what that North Star looks like for you.
Yeah.
Prayerfully kind of going through, what do we want our finances to reflect? Who do we want our finances to reflect? And writing that down up at the top so that you don't forget why you're doing this every single month. And then the more you repeat that, even if it hasn't changed your heart immediately, the more you repeat something, it will have an effect. It's why the Bible is incredibly repetitious on stuff, is because that's heart-changing language.
Is repetitious a word?
Repetitious is a word.
Is it? I was thinking repetitive would be, but interesting.
I think so.
It's fine. We'll have our producer check. That doesn't exist.
That's me.
So it's very much you. Yeah, and I want you to hear our transparency in this. But what I would say to us and what I would say to you
Repetitious is a word.
is if you're finding yourself in that cyclical pattern and there is a routine by which you've focused on your budget, maybe it's a consistent New Year's resolution. This is the year that we're going to finally get this. What I would challenge ourselves with is to take an honest look. This goes all the way back to our parable that we tried to create, right? That there's going to be some moments where we have to have some self-reflection in here, and we have to look at what are we doing with what God's given us, and what are the reasons behind it, and look at our heart. I'm not saying I think cycles are a normal part of the human experience because of how much spiritual warfare we're exposed to. But if it feels like our cycles are ever increasing and we're going through more often times where we're less focused and less effective and less intentional with the things that God has given us, and more often we are spending without a plan, we're saving without purpose, we're less generous, we're less stewardly, that's the thing that's increasing in our life instead of the inverse, where we're becoming more stewardly, more generous, more intentional. And again, we're going to go through waves, but that's what's expanding. I think the challenge here that we've got to really transparently look at is it seems abundantly clear that my life is not rooted in the fact that I want God to use me, that I want God's purpose, plan, kingdom, power to reign over my finances. And I'm saying that to us as much as I'm saying that into a microphone, that we've got to recognize if that's what our life looks like, the reason is because we have not embedded in our heart that we truly want God to reign over our money, and that we are willing to do what it takes to make that a reality. We are continuing to live under the control of our money. It is controlling us. It is motivating us. It is moving us, and not the other way around. And that is simply the reality that many of us, I think, face.
Yeah. And I would dare to say that if there is not some form of a budget in place that is continuously checked either on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis, even if you do not have control of your money, it is controlling you, or it has some form of control. You might be living in a form of surplus where it's not hindering you from stuff, but you don't the definition of control means being able to wrangle something in and having, exactly what's going in and coming out.
And why that's the case.
And why that's the case. What
you're attempting to do.
You're the one pulling the levers, where if you're living without a budget, I would go out on a limb and say money is controlling you in some form, whether you know it or not.
Yeah.
And that's been our life for the vast majority of our marriage. This is not something that I'm saying I'm casting stones of to anyone. It's just, it's the reality that I think Satan wants to blind us to. And so we're just trying to speak into existence that if we're not holding ourselves accountable for our spending, which is what a budget is, then money is going to control you in some form.
Yeah. And so we've got this big thing from Joseph, right? We've got to embed in our heart this core belief that God is wanting to use us, and that it is at war with our own innate desire to become greater, as well as Satan's active involvement in trying to slip us off the course. And so that, I think, is one of the first, most vital things we learn from Joseph. And then I think the next thing we see is his awareness of the future and what is inevitable. And when we look at Joseph's experience with Pharaoh and the result for Egypt and really the rest of the world, he has this moment where he sees this vision and he goes, okay, there's going to be 7 good years. And then following that are going to be 7 bad years. And he immediately in that moment recognizes, okay, we've got some work to do. Because if we're not careful, those 7 bad years are going to be so bad that they're going to swallow up anything that the good years had. And we're not even going to be able to remember those years. And what I want to point out is we don't have the ability to see into the future in the way that Joseph gets gifted with these visions. However, all of human history points us to we're going to go through these times in all these different levels. We can do the thumbs up thing. We're going to go through these moments in time, whether it's on a personal level. So there are many studies that point to about every 18 months or so, on average, individuals and families go through major financial things. And I mean that fairly ambiguously, in the sense that they can be positive impacts or negative impacts. They can be promotions, job changes, new homes, new children. They can be job losses, health struggles, car problems. There's a range of, it's not necessarily specific to it's going to be good or bad, but that about every 18 months on average, some major financial thing is going to occur in our lives. We can look at a more macro scale and look at the cycle of economies and the cycle of markets and things like that, and recognize that while we don't know the future and we don't know what's going to cause it or when it's going to happen, that bad times are going to come. We can look backwards and see periods of economic strife, inflation, job markets, all those kinds of things. And so unlike Joseph, where we can kind of pinpoint the day, we do know things are coming. And like Joseph, what we've got to have is a plan. Because if we don't, and we're in that space where we're not budgeting, we're not purposeful, we're not intentional, what we're going to find historically, this is our human experience, this is our personal experience, and this is probably yours too, is that when times are really, really good, we can spend that money, we can put that money to use for good, for personal things, all sorts of stuff. And then when things get really, really bleak for periods of time, often one of two things happens. Either we have to completely shut down everything and we're no longer generous, we're no longer stewardly because we're unable to be, because we were not participating in some forethought and some foresight in the periods of abundance. Or what tends to be the normal thing with our cycle of human experience is we just end up in more and more debt because we don't have any kind of control. We don't have any real plan, and our lifestyle doesn't really change that much, even though maybe our cash flow does. And we find ourselves, I talk to people all the time that they'll look back and go, a couple years ago, we had X in savings and we were earning this much, and things were good and we were doing this. And then, I took a bit of a pay cut, and we had some changes in our personal financial situation, and now 18 months later our savings is gone and we've got $10,000 worth of credit card debt that we didn't have 2 years ago, and this is a normal thing because our entire society's built on the product that we produce and what our lives look like. And so I think that's probably, the second next big thing we see from Joseph.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not even like it's one thing. I think something I'm really good at, and I'll go out on a limb to say that other people are probably really good at this too, is starting and going like, okay, we're going to do this. But what Joseph showed was the ability to make it through those 7 years. Like there's a point where they say, we're not even keeping count of what's in these granaries because there's so much in it, but yet they're still putting things in.
Yeah.
Like they didn't get to a point where they're just like, you know what, we're good. Like he saw the plan, or he saw the future, he made the plan, and he stuck with the plan, even when it almost seemed ridiculous. And so there was just this, he had such a, what am I trying to say? Like he just had like a stick to itness. that we often lack.
Yeah.
A better word will come to me, but like we'll start and we'll write on our budget and we'll be really, really good for like a week or 2 or 3, and then we'll back off of it and it'll be months and months. And so that's why your North Star has to shift. That's why your reasoning has to shift, is because you will not stick to something that was never a priority to you if your system doesn't have a check. So
his perseverance.
His perseverance. That's a good one. Stick to itness is that's probably not a word. But so he just had this ability to carry out the plan, not just speak it into existence, say, awesome, this is great, and then
not
later,
waver from it. And you have those moments in time throughout it where you get that little note in scripture, and then there's that moment a couple years into the bad years. There's some there's a purpose here. And so I think what we've tried to do in this first, half, and then we're going to spend some time on budgeting to some degree. What you'll find, I think, is it's pretty open, because we really believe the ability to budget is not the thing that's crippling us. What we really believe is crippling us is our heart and our purpose behind budgeting. And I think what Courtney just said is huge. If your goal here is to lock down budgeting so that you don't experience time at the end of the month where you're stressed out, if your goal is to lock down budgeting so that you can get to Disney World, if your goal is to lock down budgeting so that retirement can happen, none of those are necessarily bad goals at all. But they're not the thing that's going to get us to stick to this years and years down the road.
Yeah. I'll give another example. If you're still just kind of like, I just really don't know. Oftentimes on a health journey, most people want to be healthier, lose weight, get more in shape, whatever it is. Oftentimes when that is your goal, I want to lose weight, I want to be healthy, you're not going to change. It's something outside of basically just like selfish desires. It's, I want to be able to get on the floor with my grandchildren in 30 years. I want to be able to kick the soccer ball with my kid whenever they're in 4th, 5th, 6th grade. It's stuff outside of ourselves that keeps us with that perseverance, because oftentimes when goals are selfish, is when you don't have perseverance. It's when it's something outside of you. And so think of it in those terms. If it's not clicking when you go like, well, if like, I get like, I mean, I do want to retire or whatever, like selfish goal bases, although they're not bad, aren't going to likely be what keeps you on track.
And what we're trying to do is break that cycle and bridge that gap.
Hey everyone, this is Courtney. I just wanted to pop in here real quick and just let you know that in addition to working with households on finances, we also work with churches and congregations and offer stuff like seminars on topics like generosity, aging parents, and we'll work with parents on teaching kids about generosity and stuff like that. So if you're interested and if you want to talk more or learn more about what we do, our contact information will be in the show notes and you can reach out if you like. Enjoy the rest of the podcast.
And so the challenge here is to I think bring this to light. And as we move towards, okay, what's next? What are the steps? It starts with that commitment. And I think this is a conversation that we have. Mm-hmm. This is not a your problem, my problem. This is not a one spouse handles the money thing. This is not a, one family does this, this is a conversation piece that we need to be having regularly with each other to wrestle through. Do we really believe that our desire is that God reigns over this facet of our house? And to move us in a conversation piece to kind of get beyond, okay, I think these are the big things we want to learn from Joseph. That our core systems, our core belief here has to shift like Joseph's did. that we have to recognize there are going to be good times and bad times, and that the plan and the intention and the purpose needs to be unwavering and stuck to, because of that core belief in that this is so that God can reign here. And then just to get some practical kind of thoughts as we move through the last few minutes of this podcast. Something I see all the time working with people, navigating their spending, their cash flow, whatever you want to call it, is we start at the wrong step. Because we've never done that first step, right? Like step one is, are we committed to God being in charge here? And our active involvement in the kingdom flowing through the resources he's given us, the income he's given us, the savings he's given us, all these things. That's step one. Is oftentimes I think we miss that. But even then, the next step, I see a lot of people run immediately to look at their income, and they go, okay, here's what we're making, here's how much we get on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. And so we start there, and we start budgeting from that number. We're making $5,000 a month, and so we start looking at, okay, well, here's our rent or our mortgage, here's based off of that, like here's what we're going to spend on food, and what we're going to spend for gas, and what we're going to spend on entertainment or miscellaneous things.
Yeah.
And
And we
bills.
see that oftentimes when people are going to buy a house or buy a car, it's like percentages based off of income.
Yeah.
What can I afford?
Yeah.
Instead of
Yeah.
maybe the other way around, like what do I need?
Well, not even just that. Like what I'm talking about is the step one is you've got to look at what you're actually spending.
Yeah.
You've got to understand where your money is actually going. And I think the most tedious process that I commit to every client that wants to talk about budgeting, I go, here's step one. And if you can't do step one, you're not going to be able to budget well, because your headspace isn't in the right spot. You got to go look at the last 2 to 3 full months of a calendar and go pull up all your statements, pull up your bank account, pull up your credit card, pull up anywhere your money is going out of your pocket, and write down every transaction. Write down the date that it came out. Write down the amount that it came out. And you're going to notice a few things, right? And the part of this exercise is to bring to light, oftentimes when we're not budgeting, when we don't have a plan, when we're not stewarding, we're in that cycle that we've talked about so far, we haven't got a clue where things are going, and we don't realize how much we're spending in different places. So goal one of the exercise is to bring to light. So often we hear from people that go, I didn't even realize I had that subscription. We did this a couple of years ago, and we were paying for 2 different Amazon Prime subscriptions that we didn't realize was happening. And so what happens is you start to wake up and go, I didn't realize we were spending that much on this thing, or that cost that much, and so that's kind of goal one, is to just become aware, so that if you're averaging, some of our variable expenses are easier to kind of make fun of and poke at, but if you're averaging $1,500 a month eating out, but when you go and if you skip that step and you start with, okay, we make this much per month, so once we've paid all of our have-tos, once we've got all the bills paid, we've got X left over, so we're going to go, we'll spend $100 a week eating out. And where the problem and the issue comes is, if you're actually spending $1,500, and you might be spending it from places that aren't income, right? If you're putting those on credit cards and all that kind of stuff, these are different conversations we're not getting into today on debt and all that kind of stuff. But if you're actually spending $1,500, it's going to take a significant amount of work and effort to knock $1,100 of your spending habits off to shift to $100 a week. Mm-hmm. And it's not saying it's impossible, but it's nearly impossible, especially if you're completely unaware of what you're actually spending. And so sit down and write out those dollar amounts. See where your money's going. And then I typically suggest you start to categorize those things, right? There are some things you have to spend money on. You have to have a roof over your head. If you have that, you've got to have some form of utilities, electricity, things like cell phone bills and Wi-Fi are basically becoming must-have for so many of us that live in that experience. But what we then start to see is how much are we spending on those things? How much of that is coming out of our income? And so you start to kind of break these down in these categories. I have needs as two categories. You have your fixed needs, your car insurance might go up every so often in price or something, or down based off different variables. But once it's set for a period of time, 6 months or a year, it's usually fixed for that period of time. Your rent is usually fixed. Some of your other utility bills, like your phone payment, things like that, will be fixed. If you have any personal lines of insurance, those are usually fixed. Those kinds of things, you can kind of have a fixed need bucket. Then you have a variable need bucket. We have to eat. We need gas for our cars. Our electricity bill, our water bill, things like those might fluctuate. And so they're still in the needs category, but they're more moving pieces. And then you kind of have you might have a handful of other buckets that pull off of that. If you are in a spot in your life where you're trying to make intentional moves to get out of debt, whether that's car payments, student loans, credit cards, whatever, you might have a debt bucket of what are my minimum payments due here on these accounts, and what are the goals that how much more am I trying to push off onto that account and that bucket each month. And we can talk through debt in a more intentional conversation later. And then maybe you have a wants bucket of savings goals, the desire to be generous, the desire to tithe, what you're trying to put towards your retirement or other goals within your finances, and kind of tailored off of that wants bucket is kind of the other side of the wants coin of there's a difference in your food budget between groceries and eating out, of what you want to do for fun. And I'll tell you, first and foremost, my job when I work with people is not to be the budget police that sits down and goes, you can never do that ever again. But if we're spending haphazardly on things that are crippling our ability to participate in the kingdom of God, it might, I'm going to say this without step on our own toes, this is off the cuff. If our spending is so out of control that we're unable to be actively involved in the kingdom that we've been called into, we've lost the fight that Satan wants to war over us with our finances. If we are so lackadaisical, so hazardous, so unintentional, unprepared, unpurposed, you could make an argument that that's a layer of sin in our life, that our inability or our indecision, our lack of desire, our lack of control has slipped us into a space where we have, by fault of our own, removed ourselves from the calling that God has on our lives. A really personal space I see that in, that I think we have to be aware of as we move forward. We think about the good times and the bad times. Courtney quit her job back in September of last year to join working with us, and there were a lot of reasons that were really, really good that we wanted to do this, that it was going to help our practice, help our folks, we were going to work with her clients better, and she's done all of that, to be able to spend more time at home with us, with Lily, all those kinds of things, and it has done all the good things we were hoping it would do. But going into it, we knew on the front end, it was going to be a pretty significant pay cut. I mean, we were going to have to figure out benefits and income and all this kinds of stuff. And so there was just a shift that needed to take place. And when Lily was born, we bought a car that we could easily afford where we were at in that day. It's a good car. It's a safe car, all that kind of stuff. It is not, I don't think it's an egregious expense, by any stretch of the imagination, but it, among other things, when our income changed last year, became a point of stress, right? I mean, we're okay. But it definitely slowed our ability to do other things, that are maybe more important than make a car payment. And that is a microcosm of, how we want to make decisions moving forward is we want to prioritize active involvement in the kingdom. We want to prioritize showing Lily what it looks like for a family to be intentional with their money for the purposes of God. And that means we have to own some of the decisions we made in those periods of abundance that were not actively looking ahead and going, okay, but there are going to be things that change or make a difference.
Yeah. And if you're like a lot of us, one of the biggest ways that I learn is unfortunately through mistakes. I wish that I could read all of the things that I should do and stuff, but it's through mistakes that a lot of these lessons are learned. And so I think that one was one of the good ones that opened up my eyes to we were living in the 7 years of abundance. And in hindsight, and this is not always for everyone or whatever, but for us personally, in hindsight, one is we easily could have paid off the car or like saved up and like paid cash for it.
Yeah.
Very easily. And we didn't because we just had like we just weren't thinking of the 7 years of scarcity that might be around the corner. And so we just kind of were living in a world where that would always be the case. And it's just one of those things to remind you that there are just things to prioritize. And again, it changes for different people and different families and different situations. But like, I fully believe that if you are prayerful over your spending, if you are prayerful over your budgeting, if you have a North Star and that is what you're putting in your heart, I truly believe that God will guide your spending decisions. And something that we should have done in purchasing the car, because he might have guided us to like, no, like this is not something that you need. And who knows what would have happened? It doesn't matter because we sought control over the situation. But yeah, just that's just like a personal little tidbit.
And so what I want to do, like the main point of this podcast, this whole series, as we walk through budgeting and other kind of big financial topics, is to really wrestle with our core belief system. If one of the fundamental episodes of the system is that is the flow of our behavior. It's gonna start with what we believe to be true about God and money. Then we want to wrestle with what do we believe to be true about God and money, and what does that do to impact us. I think we're gonna try and create some more small scale content moving forward on budgeting topics, and probably not through the podcast, but maybe as resources on our website and on our social media platforms and things like that, to do some quick reviews on maybe different softwares out there that help people with budgeting, different apps, different technologies, different strategies. But I've seen the whole gamut of people. There are folks we talk to and work with that are yellow legal pad and pencil budgeters. There are folks that are using Excel spreadsheets that they have intimately designed with all of these different formulas and automatic color filters inside of the squares and everything that they've built out. There are some people that RIP Mint were really big into using Mint's software and have shifted into some other places like Monarch or Rocket Money, and none of these are endorsements of these things. And then there are some other more heavily focused on some of Dave Ramsey's thoughts in using the Every Dollar Budget or app, or the other source of You Need a Budget. And this is just a drop in the bucket on all of the resources that are out there to help us budget. And this is one of the reasons why we strongly believe the ability to budget is not the thing that's killing us. It's our lack of understanding of why we budget, and our whole societal belief of this budget idea of budgeting becomes the prison that we live in and the cage that we lock ourselves in. And it means that we don't get to have fun anymore. We don't get to do the things that we want to do. And I think what Joseph is trying to tell us from the grave through Scripture is that budgeting is the opposite. Budgeting is the key that unlocks all of that, the key that allows us to live the life that we're called to live, that allows us to bridge the gap between our faith and our finances and no longer hold those two things in separate hands, to recognize that the money, the possessions, the material, the income, the time that we have in this life are holy things that God has entrusted us with. And we are called to serve Him, but not just for the sake of that, but because our belief system about money has shifted to, that's the best version of the life that we have available to live. And so we're going to run through some, you could budget this way, you could use this thing in kind of shorter snippets over the next coming, weeks and months as we have time, and we'll continue to put those out there. In the meantime, if this is something you struggle with personally and you're looking for a little more intentional guidance, feel free to reach out to us. I'd be glad to sit down and help you however I can walk through this. The church is desperate for us to figure out how to master our money for the purposes of the kingdom.
Yeah. And I think like the last thing that I would say, because a lot of us will go, you can just go to Google and kind of see like different budgeting ways, but the best budget that you can have is the one that you'll stick with. There's going to be ones that are very, very involved, require a lot of your time and a lot of your attention to detail. I'm someone that really likes the automated nature of like the software that connects all my bank accounts and like almost does like all the work for me. And I just see like where we might have gone over 1 month and then looking into like why we went over in that one category. Yeah. And so things like, I was a really big Mint fan when it was, available. We use Rocket Money. Again, not an endorsement. It's whatever you'll stick with.
Well, and I think, it's recognizing that the budget's the tool, right? So a tool is only as good as it's used. You can have the fanciest hammer at the store, and if it just sits in the corner all the time. So building and implementing strategies of how does this become a regular point of conversation within your life, within your family, within your purpose. And I think that flows from utilizing this tool, whichever tool you choose to pick up for your budget. Utilizing it is key to truly honoring this belief system we have that God is calling us to use our money and our resources for the kingdom, to budget in our life ways in which we can be involved in what it is that He's actively doing in the world around us, in our churches and all these other spaces. And so we will have more conversations, I'm sure, in the future, and hopefully some more kind of shorter pieces of content and other things that we'll put out there. But just know that I think that's the ultimate shift. That like Joseph, we've got to change our focus, change our motivation. We've got to recognize that there are going to be good times and bad, and all throughout, we've got to start to pick up the tool that is budgeting to master our money and allow God to work through us for the advancement of His kingdom, the service of the gospel, and to just bring about His world. Yeah. Here.
And until next week, maybe you as a family, you as your close friend group, whatever, can think of what that North Star, whatever you can write on the top of your budget, something that's not goal-based, but it's outside of yourself. It's what you want, how you want to participate in the kingdom, and be prayerful over it. And we'll see y'all next week. Bye, guys.